Hi there, welcome back to Read by the Author with me, Lindsey Sparks. I apologize if you're watching in or listening in real time as I release these. Life is chaotic and not necessarily allowing me to record on a regular schedule. Plus, last Sunday, which is my recording day, is always Sunday evenings, was Easter, and so we had like a big get together with my family and stuff. So it was just not possible. So I am here today to continue reading Dissonance, which is novella 2.5 in the ECHO Trilogy. So it is the novella that takes place between books 2 and 3. As always, you wouldn't know this. If this is your first show that you're tuning into, stop. This is not where you want to start. You would like to start back at season 1 with Echo in Time. If you start here, you'll be so confused. So, with that, I think, I didn't even mention, this is season 4, episode 2. I'm so silly. Sorry about that. So with that, let's dive back into the story. 3. Was and Is. Dominic drove the Range Rover off the ferry, Neffy in the front passenger seat, Nick and me right behind them, and Kat in the very back, earbuds and iPod blaring something with equal amounts of whininess and yelling, and that was downright terrible. I was eternally grateful for headphones, especially where Kat's music was concerned. I just wished I could turn down my heightened sense of hearing so I wouldn't be able to hear the ear sore at all. And then there was Neffy, who had taken control of the SUV's stereo system and was continuing her mission to convert us all into smooth jazz enthusiasts. It wasn't that I disliked her taste in music, rather it just sort of faded into the background whenever I was listening to it. When Nick started humming along, I glanced at him, surprised that he was familiar enough with the tune to harmonize with it perfectly. But he didn't notice, just kept on staring out the window and humming softly. Some 20 minutes later, we were exiting I-5 and making our way down 45th Street toward the north end of the University of Washington campus. I stirred out of my car coma when Dominic continued straight through an intersection instead of turning right and headed toward the hospital, where Neffy would be spending the afternoon in the better-equipped labs running tests on Tarset's blood, tissue, and saliva samples. Money, I was quickly learning, could buy almost anything, including access to world-renowned research facilities via an exorbitant donation. And if there was one thing Haru's line wasn't lacking in, it was money. Being able to see the future and all that, but it was the doors that money could open that might just prove invaluable. Neffy would be using this expensive opportunity to compare her samples to what Aset claimed was one of the most extensive libraries of poisons, toxins, and pathogens we were likely to find outside of a CDC facility. I leaned forward and placed my hand on top of Dominic's seat. "Where are you going?" "To the lot behind Denny." "But why? Then Neffy'll be wasting a solid 40 minutes walking to and from the hospital, and she could use that time in the labs." I shook my head. "All I'm doing is meeting with Dr. Ramirez, and that's not for another hour. At least drop her off first." "I don't mind the walk," Neffy said. "I prefer it, actually. It helps me process my findings. And this is the best way to minimize your exposure to danger." Dominic's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror for the briefest moment. "Which is my main priority, considering your condition." "That's ridiculous," I snapped. "I'm pregnant, Dom. I'm not an invalid." But even as I said the words, I knew that to the other 4 Nejerets in the car, an invalid was exactly what I was. The nearly impossible physiological phenomenon that had allowed a Nejeret like myself to even become pregnant muted my body's natural ability to regenerate, making me as vulnerable as a regular old human. This didn't seem nearly as worrisome to me as it did to them. After all, I had spent 2.5 decades as a vulnerable human and barely half a year as a Nejeret. The other's silence following my hasty protestation only confirmed what I was just now coming to accept weeks into the pregnancy. For the next 8 months, I would be weakened, fragile, vulnerable, an invalid. Damn it. Instead of arguing, I crossed my arms over my chest, stared out the window, and kept my mouth shut as Dominic parked in the small lot behind Denny Hall. The century-old anthropology building was as stunning as ever, with its chateau-like exterior, proud bell tower, and windows gleaming with reflected sunlight. I wasn't the least bit surprised that being back here felt a lot like coming home, even if I was a tad bit irritated. Neffy hopped out almost as soon as we came to a stop, not even waiting for Dominic to turn off the engine. "I'll text you when I'm on my way back," she told Dominic, then started to shut the door. My half-brother reached across the center console and stopped the door from shutting completely with a palm on the side panel. "Perhaps it would be wise to take Katarina with you." I glanced back, not the least bit surprised to find Kat staring out the window, apparently oblivious to the conversation, or to the fact that we'd even parked. "She could assist you in your work." "She would only get in my way," Neffy said. "Besides, I'm sure she'd much prefer to stay with you and Lex, and..." She cleared her throat. "With you and Lex." I watched Kat in my peripheral vision. She gave no indication that she had heard, which wasn't surprising considering that her earbuds were still in place. Except I could no longer hear her music, which meant that, earbuds or no, she could definitely hear Dominic's and Neffy's mutual attempts to pawn her off on the other. My heart twanged with sympathy and more than a hint of empathy. I was no stranger to feeling like an unwelcome burden, either. After all, Marcus had run far and fast, and had stayed away for months, as soon as he had figured out who I really was. I couldn't stand the feeling of Kat feeling unwanted all day, not when today was supposed to be our one outing for who knew how long. Not at all. "Good," I said, hoping the single word hadn't sounded over-enthusiastic. "This'll give me a chance to show her all my old haunts, maybe convert her into a future husky." I didn't miss the way Nick's eyes narrowed the slightest bit, but the way the corner of his mouth tensed, like he was holding back a frown. Or maybe a smile. "How lovely," Neffy said. "Can I go now? I do have a lot to do in a short period of time." In one smooth motion, Dominic let go of the door and straightened in his seat. Just as quickly, Neffy shut the door and was walking away from the car. I twisted in my seat and patted Kat's knee. "Ready, Freddie?" She made a show of pulling out her headphones as she turned red-rimmed, glassy eyes my way. She averted her gaze down to her phone almost immediately. Oh, yeah, she had definitely heard everything. Kat and I had to wait a solid 10 minutes for Dominic and Nick to scout the area immediately surrounding Denny Hall. Kat moved up to Nick's middle seat instead of waiting in the back. We were silent for several minutes, her phone forgotten in her hand and her eyes locked on the seemingly abandoned campus just beyond the window while I stared out at the small patch of road that had played so prominently in the dream. Physically being here, so close to the spot where I had seen Dr. Ramirez die, real or not, was proving to be even more unsettling than the dream itself had been. Gone was the brief blip of comfort I felt at returning to this place. Now I felt antsy and on edge. I felt like I should have stayed with Marcus on Bainbridge, like I shouldn't have been here. Must be hormones, I thought, shaking my head. Likely they were to blame for all of it. The weird feeling, the dream, my irritation with Marcus for agreeing to let me go. Finally, Kat cleared her throat. "Thanks," she said quietly. When I turned my head to look at her, I found her still staring out the window. I studied her profile, not for the first time searching for the similarities between us that others claimed were so obvious when they saw us together. I supposed it wasn't surprising. We were half-sisters through Set, after all, though I still had a hard time seeing the resemblance with either Kat or my other half-sibling, Dominic. I figured it was psychological. I had met both of them thinking they were strangers, unrelated to me in any way. I couldn't have been more wrong. "Thanks for what?" I asked, smiling to myself. I was glad I had been so wrong, because I adored both of these strangers turned siblings more than I ever could have imagined. Just, Kat shrugged and shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. For I don't know. She wiped her hands on her cutoffs and looked at me for the first time since moving up a seat. The usual luster in her eyes was dimmed, her whole spunky demeanor somehow wilted. Even her crown of a bun seemed a little droopy. Hey. I reached over and gave her an awkward side hug. I'm glad you're here, Kit Kat. She gave me a doubtful look. Really? Really, I said, pulling back but keeping my arm partially draped over her shoulders. It's a relief to have a break from seriouser, and seriousest out there. At least with you here, I know I'll have someone to laugh with. She perked up visibly. Why are they always so serious anyway? She smiled wanly and tucked her phone into her jeans pocket. I mean, what's the point of living forever if you're allergic to fun? I snorted and rolled my eyes. I'm not positive. I met her gaze conspiratorially. Considering I'm only 8 months into forever, but I'm starting to think that the definition of fun changes several centuries in. We'll catch up eventually. Or we'll remind them how they used to be, Kat said, her eyes twinkling. All signs of glassy-eyed sadness were gone. Her luster and spunk returned in full force. At a tap on the window on my side, we both jumped. Nick gave the all-clear thumbs up, and Kat and I pushed open our doors. In the future, maybe try not to give the pregnant invalid a heart attack, I muttered to Nick. He blinked, his expression blank. I never said you were an invalid. He shut the Range Rover's door as I adjusted my patchwork leather shoulder bag and looked around for Dominic. I believe that was your word, that you've now used twice. I said I wasn't one, and that's not the point, I said in a huff, crossing my arms over my chest. Nick paused, his hand still on the side of the car, and gave me a curious look. He cocked his head to the side and took a step toward me, his irises fading from pale blue to opalescent white as Ra took over. Are you feeling all right, Alexandra? You seem unusually agitated today. Is it the hormones? Dude, Kat said as she rounded the back of the Range Rover. You did not just tell a pregnant lady she's being too hormonal, did you? I looked from Kat to Ra, Nick, to Kat, and back, then blew out a breath. He did, but it's okay. He's right. I relaxed my arms at my sides and shook my head. I don't know if it's the hormones or what, but I shrugged. The past few nights I've had this dream about an accident that happened right here, I said, pointing to the spot by the road some 50 yards away. I had the same dream last year. It was my first echo, and it was of a possible future that never actually happened, but still, the dream was troubling, and I've been on edge ever since. Like I'm waiting for the accident to really happen, which is ridiculous because it was supposed to happen last winter, and it never did. I hiked my bag up higher on my shoulder, and I guess being here just is making me antsier, so yeah. You dreamed of this bygone possibility last night, you said. Nick asked. Biting my lip, I nodded. Was it simply a regular dream or an odd dream? Well, I frowned. Honestly, it felt like an odd dream. Nick's eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth turned down in a frown. Such a thing should be impossible, and I do not use that word lightly. What do you mean? I asked, not sure I wanted the answer. Nick took his time, filling the silence with more thoughtful squinting and a several thousand-mile stare. All unfulfilled future possibilities disappear from the art at the moment they are passed by. He paused for several heartbeats, and it felt like forever. I know this may sound confusing, but that echo, a bygone possibility of a future that never happened, should not exist anymore. So it was just a dream then, Kat said. Case closed. Both of them stared at me, waiting for a response I couldn't give them. Because I felt fairly certain that it had been an odd dream, and that was precisely why it had been bothering me so much. According to Ra, I shouldn't have been able to view an echo of Dr. Ramirez being hit by a car last December because Dr. Ramirez hadn't been hit by a car. And the echo should have winked out of existence when the moment passed. And yet, I'm not sure. You are not sure of what, Lex? Dominic asked as he jogged around the front of the car. It's a long story, I said, frustration evident in my tone. I could only think of one way to set my overactive imagination and buzzing nerves to rest. I needed to venture into the OT and examine the echo in question. When it showed me making my solo, uneventful trip to get coffee without Dr. Ramirez getting hit by a car, then I would know once and for all that it had truly been a dream and that I was getting myself worked up over nothing. I have to check the OT, I told the others. Upon taking in my companion's question and doubt-filled faces, I added, I can't explain why, but I have to do this. It was Nick who nodded first, then Kat. Dominic returned my stare, his dark eyes hard, his expression set. The OT is unstable. I will accompany you. I wasn't surprised and didn't argue. I was anxious enough about this particular trip into the OT not to want to argue, and it would go a long way to setting my jumpy nerves at ease to have him there with me. All right, I said, easing myself down onto the hot pavement and sitting cross-legged. I reached up for Dominic to join me on the ground, flashing him what I hoped was a reassuring smile. Let's get this over with. Because I felt certain that as soon as I proved to myself that all was as it should be, the mounting sense of waiting for something to happen would evaporate. All of this echo dream, dread, and confusion would be behind us, and we would be able to enjoy ourselves, worry-free. I felt certain of it. Ish. 4. See and believe. Oh my God, Dr. Ramirez! Horrified and filled with disbelief, so intense it was verging on denial, I watched a past version of myself stumble toward my graduate advisor's lifeless body. This couldn't be happening. There was no way. Except it was happening, right before my eyes. Some false version of the past was playing out in an echo that couldn't exist. Unless... I froze the impossible echo and turned to face Dominic. Our hands were linked, enabling us to maintain our connection in the echo, a necessity now that the OT was far from stable. It could be a false echo, I told him. Someone could have created the whole thing. Dominic pressed his lips together, thinning them further, and scanned the paused scene surrounding us. Possibly, but it does not have the feel of a false echo, he said. And he would know. We both had the somewhat rare ability to manipulate the OT, to create cloaks to hide something in an echo or fabricate whole new echoes entirely. But Dominic had a lot more experience with the skill, more than 4 centuries worth of experience. Well, I pursed my lips and moved them from side to side as I thought. A drizzle of rain trailed within arm's distance in front of me, and I reached out to tap the delicate strand of frozen in time water. What looked like the most delicate icicle in existence. If someone created a false echo in this time and place, for whatever reason, it's much more likely that they altered the echo because of my presence, not because of Dr. Ramirez's. Don't you think? Dominic nodded slowly. Considering not only Nejerets, but the Messuet, yes, I'd say that's a fair assumption. Good, that's good, I said, some of the threads of worry that had wrapped around my heart loosening. This was about me, not Dr. Ramirez. For whatever reason, that made me feel better. And yet, those strands of worry were still there, intermixed with doubt and dread. I offered Dominic a wan smile. Still, wouldn't hurt to check how far this thing reaches. Dominic frowned just a little, but before he could say anything, I jumped forward an hour. The echo darkened as the day grew later. It was no longer raining, but the street and sidewalks were still wet, the red, blue, and white police and ambulance lights reflecting on their shimmering surfaces. Because according to this echo, the accident had still happened. My heart clenched. Abandoning this location, I switched my focus to Dr. Ramirez himself. Like my grandfather, Alexander, I was a tracker. If I focused on any specific person or object, I could track said person or object through the entire span of time the person or object had existed. Finding when Dr. Ramirez popped back into existence seemed to me the simplest way to figure out how far-reaching this mangled portion of the yacht truly was. Except Dr. Ramirez supposedly didn't exist during the rest of the day of the accident or the day after. Taking a deep breath, I closed my eyes and squeezed Dominic's hand. On our own, we were each extremely powerful Nejerets, thanks to Set's almost pristine bloodline. But when our Baws worked together, when we pooled our Nejeret power, our collective control over the yacht was pretty damn flawless. And with the yacht's current instability, that was something I needed right about now. I pushed forward in time, keeping my focus on Dr. Ramirez. He continued to not exist the days following the accident, and the week after. He didn't exist a month out, or 2 months, or 3. This can't be happening, I said, panic making my voice thready. Nobody would go to the trouble to erase him like this. It would take forever to do this. It's been done before, Dominic said, his thickening accent telling me he was battling his own growing concern. Yeah, but that was Hitler. Apep wanted the chaos he would bring to the world. But Dr. Ramirez is just a professor of archaeology. What could he possibly do in the future that would make anyone, want to hide his actions by erasing his existence from the day of the accident on? It is impossible to see that which has been hidden, Dominic said. I do not mean to trouble you further, Lex, but it is possible that something has since happened to your Dr. Ramirez, and that only a small period of time was altered in the yacht. I shook my head adamantly. He's not really dead, Dom. I mean, we just exchanged emails a few days ago. I fought my rising panic. He's the whole reason this day trip turned into a group excursion rather than just Neffy coming out here to do her research alone. I was fully aware that Dominic knew all of this, but some part of me was convinced that if my words could banish the doubt in his midnight eyes, everything would be all right. Dominic hesitated to speak, but his lips eventually parted, and the words that left his mouth elicited a whole new maelstrom of panic. Anyone can send an email, Lex. They just need access to the account. 5. Bad and worse. Lex, wait! Dominic yelled after me as I raced across the small parking lot toward the pathway that edged around the side of Denny Hall. I have to know! I shouted over my shoulder, my sandals slapping against the asphalt. Know what? Nick asked a moment before his hand latched onto my arm and he pulled me to a halt. I was still a few strides from the curb, couldn't even see the steep steps leading up to the anthropology building's front doors, and acting on instinct, I yanked to free my arm. The attempt was pointless. Nick's grip was unyielding. I have to make sure he's okay, I told my ancient friend, pleading with my voice and eyes and more useless tugs against his grip. Let go, Nick, please. Do not let her go, Dominic said as he strode toward us, Cat close behind him. She could be running into a trap. I can't believe we were so careless. Nick's expression hardened. What did you find in the art? Let me go and I'll tell you, I said, feeling both obstinate and defeated. Dominic was right. My instinctive reaction had been reckless and would have endangered not only myself, but Marcus and our unborn child as well. I pressed my free hand against my lower abdomen in silent apology. Not a heartbeat later, I caught the eye of a lone co-ed crossing the mouth of the small lot. She pulled her phone out of her back pocket, her face an open question. Did I need help? Should she call the police? Considering Nick's appearance and the way he was restraining me, not to mention Dominic and Kat's presence nearby, almost looking like they'd come over to suss out the situation, I couldn't blame the young woman for jumping to such conclusions. I shook my head at her, offering her a small smile of thanks. Between clenched teeth, I said, Let go, Nick, before someone tries to play hero. Nick's eyes tensed, but he did let go. After he had stepped around me to block my access to the pathway, of course. Despite my title of Messwet, prophesied girl child and savior to our people, and my honorary position on the Council of Seven, sometimes I felt more like a prisoner than a leader. And by sometimes, I meant most of the time. How well the council had ignored my input this morning about their debate over Raw Nick joining them being an exercise in futility was further proof of that. Nick leaned in closer to me, his words as sharp and heated as the determination in his pale blue eyes. Everything I do to keep you safe. Everything. His unwavering gaze shifted from me to Dominic and back. Now tell me what happened in the Ot. I quickly relayed what we had and hadn't discovered, making sure he understood just how important it was to me to make sure Dr. Ramirez was okay. One way or another, I was determined to get my eyes into Denny Hall to check on him. Nick was quiet for a long moment, then let out a heavy sigh. Sorry, Lex, but I'm inclined to agree with Dom here, and so is Raw. There's no way you're going in there now. But... Nick crossed his arms, flashing me one of his fresher tattoos, an evergreen tree line ringing his forearm in an array of black and grays. Shoulders slumping, I slunk away from him toward our car and settled once more on the sun-warmed asphalt. Part of me was starting to wonder if they were right, if something had happened to Dr. Ramirez, something hidden under the apparent cluster of false echoes, and the person I had been emailing with to set up this meeting had, in reality, been an imposter. Dominic followed me and stood between me and the midday sun, his shadow a cool contrast to the warm asphalt. Do you still have his number, Lex? I looked up at him, eyebrows raised in question. Dr. Ramirez's? He nodded. Yes? Well, it's simple then. Dominic sat on the ground beside me. It was the most perfect balm for my agitated mood. His presence always had an almost magically calming effect on my troubled soul. Call Dr. Ramirez, he said. If he answers, then we'll know he's all right and that the meeting is benign enough. I searched his eyes, the blackish-brown hue of his irises speckled with bronze in the sunlight, seeking answers he couldn't know. But the Ot, even if he answers, something's still wrong with what the Ot thinks happened last winter. Dominic's shoulders rose and fell, and his head moved from side to side. It's something we'll have analyzed when we get back. But, it'll be okay, Lex, Kat said, sitting on the ground on the other side of me and taking my hand in hers. We'll figure this out. Nick took several steps toward the nearest pine tree in the foliage bordering the lot and placed his hand against its rough bark. I have, in rare occasions in the past, noticed an odd occurrence when certain of my more notable and powerful descendants manifested. From the accent and cadence of his words, it was obvious that Ra had taken over. They create something of a disturbance in the art surrounding the first few echoes they viewed. It happened with Nick, of course, Ra Nick said, touching his own chest, as well as with all of my direct children and some of their children, such as Heru, Aset, and Set. Over time, I came to believe that it meant those individuals would have a distinct effect on the events to come, that their presence in the art would be disproportionately significant. My eyebrows drew together. So you think because that echo with Dr. Ramirez getting hit by a car was the first one I viewed, I might have disrupted it to the point of changing all the following related echoes as well? It sounded like a stretch to me, but then so did my whole life. I have never seen such a far-reaching disruption, but considering your significance to maintaining Ma'at, universal balance quite literally depends on the fates of you and the children you carry. I can't bring myself to believe that such a large disturbance in the art is out of the realm of possibility. The answer was so much like Nguyen, Ra's original Nejeret host, that my heart warmed. Nguyen had always had the damnedest time admitting that he simply didn't know something. I smiled to myself and reached into my bag to fish out my phone. Okay, so I call Dr. Ramirez, and let's say he answers. Then what? After unlocking my phone, I scrolled through the contacts until I reached the D's. Are we still suspicious of foul play at that point, or can we assume this is simply a harmless meeting and we can all go into Denny? I gave Kat's hand a squeeze. Does Kit Kat still get the grand tour? I watched Dominic and Nick exchange a prolonged glance. Watched Nick's irises bleed back to their usual pale blue hue. Finally, Nick shook his head. It's not worth the risk, Lex. Ask him to meet you somewhere else. Somewhere crowded with humans. Nodding slowly, I thought about where to propose Dr. Ramirez meet with me, my thumb hovering over the green call button. I considered the hub and, by George, the two main places to eat on campus. It was after noon, and we had planned to eat before the meeting anyway. A hungry Nejeret is a grumpy Nejeret, after all. The Husky Union building, affectionately called the Hub by anybody who knew anything at all about the U, would likely be more crowded since it was lunchtime and there were more dining options in comparison to By George, aptly named due to its proximity to a rather prominent statue of George Washington, and its cafeteria-style dining. But the Hub was also clear across campus, which I doubted would please my not unwanted but very overprotective bodyguards. There was also the nearby Burke Cafe, but it was tiny and rarely crowded. Suddenly, an idea struck me, and I sat up straighter, smiling broadly. It was so obvious. I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it right away. I know just the place. It had been ages since I'd been in Suzzalo Library. Okay, maybe only months, but it felt like ages when I was used to spending hours there every day, hunting through the stacks or hunched over a wooden desk with a wall of rarely opened books blocking me off from the world. The cafe on the first floor would serve our dining purposes well enough. It had a full-service coffee bar and grab-and-go sandwiches, pastries, and snacks, but it would also give me a chance to show Kat around one of my favorite places on campus. One day, all of this universe at stake hoopla would be over, and she'd go to college like a normal kid, and I'd be damned if I didn't try my hardest to convince her to become a Husky. I pressed my thumb to the screen and called Dr. Ramirez. After 3 rings with no answer, I held my breath. After the 4th, I squeezed my eyes shut, and after the 5th, my heart was beating so hard it felt like it was pounding against my ribcage. You've reached the mailbox for 206-555-0173, said the emotionless automatic recording. Author's note. I really hope that I looked that up to make sure that was an okay phone number to use. I know there's fake phone numbers that you can use. There's a certain series of numbers that are used in fiction and stuff. So hopefully I did that and that's not someone's real number. The caller you're trying to reach is not available. Please leave a message at the tone. Panicking, I ended the call before the beep. I looked at Dominic, then up at Nick, knowing they had heard the impersonal recording as well. At least the number's not disconnected, I said softly. It was the only thing I could think to point out that didn't lend further credence to the possibility that something had happened to Dr. Ramirez and that this whole meeting was just an elaborate ruse. A trap. I think you should get back into the car, Lex, Nick said, turning his back to me so he could scan the countless trees and shrubs scattered nearby for potential dangers. I didn't even consider arguing. There was no point, and he was right. The situation was looking grimmer and grimmer with each passing minute. I was on my feet, my hand on the door handle, when my phone buzzed twice to alert me of a text message. Hastily, I unlocked the phone and opened the message. It was from Dr. Ramirez, or at least it was from his number. Sorry I missed your call, Lex. Is everything all right? Do you need to reschedule? I had a cancellation, so my whole afternoon is free, if another time works better for you. I stared at the phone's screen, dim in the bright sunlight, my hands shaking. I could feel Kat behind me, reading over my shoulder. Why didn't he just call you back? Kat's voice wavered a little. Am I the only one wondering that? No, I said under my breath. No, you're not. that is where we're going to stop for this episode. I will be back hopefully next week. There's always a chance that it won't happen because there's a cold going through my house right now. Somehow I have miraculously not contracted it, but my immune system is not top notch, so it is very rare for me to escape unscathed. So we'll see what happens. If I am not back next Sunday to record again, you know why. The episode is not there. So hopefully I am. Hopefully everything's great. And until then, happy reading.